Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day, and we are going to be starting the National Identity Unit. Our objective today is we will, through reading, writing, and discussion, describe what actions the first Congress took to launch the new government. We have 3 vocab words today. Our first one is precedent. Now this word sounds a lot like president, so you have to be really careful when you say it. Precedent is a tradition. Something started that others follow. Washington set precedents that are still followed today. Just call me Mr. President. Our second word is cabinet. The cabinet are the heads of the executive departments that help advise the president. 8th grade. Well-known, talented leaders that headed the government departments. SIG. Washington could not do everything himself and thought it would be wise to use experts to help him. And our third and final word of the day is national identity. National identity is how a country views its culture, language, traditions, and politics. 8th grade, how a country views itself. President Washington was elected the first president of the United States. He was 57 years old when he was elected, and he took his oath of office on April 30th, 1789. Now, no office created more suspicion among the people than the office of president. George Washington was actually the perfect man to become our first president because he was so well respected and so trusted by the people. This office created a lot of suspicion because they had a bad experience with England and the king, and they thought that if the wrong person got in there, they would become like the king and take their rights away. So, even though the people trusted Washington, he knew that he would be under the microscope, meaning that everybody was going to be watching everything that he did, and no slip-up would go unnoticed. So he kind of had a big responsibility because he knew that the precedents that he would set would shape the future of the United States. So he had to get it right because he knew the guys that followed him would be doing the same thing. So he felt that responsibility. He felt that added pressure. One precedent that he established was how people would address him. John Adams suggested when they were talking about it, how about let's call you Your Highness, the President of the United States. Your Highness, the President of the United States. Would you like a glass of water? Your Highness, the President of the United States. Can I get something for you? Washington was like, what? Just call me Mr. President. And that's what they did, and they still use that term today. Next, Washington and Congress had to figure out how to use the new Constitution to structure the new government. You know, they worked really hard on this Constitution, and they got it all done, and Washington gets elected, and Congress gets elected, and then they're like, now what? They had to figure it out. It's like when you make up a game, and you start playing the game, and then something happens in the game that you didn't take into account, and then you got to figure it out. Well, a lot of things like that happened when they started operating the government. For example, the Constitution gave Congress the power to establish executive departments, but it didn't say who the head of these departments would report to. Do they report to the president or do they report to Congress? So the first Congress, in 1789, Congress set up 3 departments in the executive branch. Now the executive branch, remember, is they carry out the laws or enforce the laws. Well, Washington was the head of the executive branch, but he can't do everything himself. So Congress set up 3 departments to help him carry out the laws. The first one was the State Department, which handles relations with other nations. The second department they set up was the Department of the Treasury, which deals with the country's financial matters. And the third department they set up was the War Department that provided for the nation's defense. Now, back then they called it the War Department, but today it's called the Department of Defense. Now, at the beginning of his term, Washington named well-known, talented leaders to head these government departments. And this was one of the first, this was a precedent that he set. He could not do everything himself, and he thought it would be wise to use experts to help him. Okay, besides these 3 departments, they also set up 2 offices. They created 2 offices. The Office of the Attorney General, which handled the government's legal affairs, and the Office of the Postmaster General to direct the Postal Service. Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General. I don't think he held that post very long because he was like very old when he got that job in his 80s. But he had a big job to do because we really didn't have any postal system set up at the time. Now our first for each one of these departments, each one has a head, and the head of the department is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. And the head of each department has a title. The head of the State Department is called the Secretary of State. The head of the Treasury is called the Secretary of the Treasury. And the head of the War Department is called the Secretary of War. So whatever the department is, the head of it is the secretary of that department. So Washington's first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was a well-known, talented leader. He had served time in Europe and France, and he had connections in other places in the world, so he was a good person to handle relations with other nations. The first Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. He was an excellent choice for Secretary of Treasury because he was a financial genius. He just knew his way around finances. He understood them, and he came up with a plan later on that kind of fixed our country's finances. The first Secretary of War was Henry Knox, and the first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. Now, Washington met with these men regularly, and they became known as his cabinet. Now, today, or back then, they had 3 executive departments. Well, today, they have 15 executive departments that are included in the president's cabinet. So, in modern times, the president's cabinet has the vice president, the heads of the 15 executive departments, and the attorney general. Now, the departments that they have today are agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services, homeland security, housing and urban development, interior, labor, state, transportation, treasury, and veterans affairs. So it's definitely expanded over the last 250 years or so. And you can see the original ones are here: the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of Defense, which was originally called the Department of War. Congress created the departments, but they were divided on how much power the president should have over them. For example, should the president be able to replace an official he had appointed and the Senate had confirmed? So at the time, we had 13 states and 2 senators from each state, so there were 26 senators in the Senate, and they were discussing this matter. Well, exactly half of the senators thought that once they were appointed and once they were approved, Washington, or the president, should have total control over the people working under him. And if they weren't doing their job, then he should be able to fire them without consulting the Senate. Well, half the people said since the Senate approved him, then the Senate should be involved somehow when they get dismissed. So they were split on the issue. Since they were split, the vice president comes into play. Now, John Adams was the first vice president, and the vice president's job is basically to wait for the president to die. Well, he's not just going to sit around and do nothing, so they had to think of a job for the vice president to do. So his main job while he's serving as vice president is to be the president of the Senate. So he basically sits up on the podium and runs the Senate meetings. He stands up there and hits his gavel and says, "This meeting will come to order." He recognizes the senators and kind of just runs the meeting. Well, he doesn't vote. He doesn't have voting rights unless there is a tie and they can't break it. If there's a tie, then the vice president or the president of the Senate gets a vote and he breaks the tie. Well, Adams decided to vote that once they are appointed and once they are approved, then the president has total control over them, and if he doesn't like him, he can fire him on his own. So this allowed the president to dismiss cabinet offers without Senate's approval. The decision did 3 things. 1, it strengthened the president. 2, it created greater separation between the legislative and executive branches, because now the president doesn't have to check with Congress every time he does something. And 3, it established the president's authority over the executive branch, which made him in charge. So John Adams did a lot for the office of the president before he became president by the way he voted in that situation. So the Judiciary Act was next on Congress's agenda. Congress also had to decide how to set up the nation's court system. The Constitution briefly mentioned a Supreme Court, but wanted Congress to take care of the details. Disagreements between a uniform federal court system or a state court system. Some of the people, there were already state courts, and some people thought that they should just use those. Other people thought that if they had a uniform federal court system, that they could just get rid of the state courts. Well, they were arguing and they couldn't decide, so they decided to compromise. So they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the federal court system. Under the Judiciary Act of 1789, they created 13 district courts, 3 circuit courts, and 1 Supreme Court. Now this is the federal court system. State courts would remain, but federal courts would have the power to reverse state decisions. So, all state courts, and state courts have a state Supreme Court as well, are lower than the federal courts. The Supreme Court would be the final authority on many issues. Washington nominated John Jay as his Chief Justice. So John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So here is the setup. The federal court system consists of one Supreme Court, the court of last resort, 3 circuit courts, and 13 district courts. And all these federal courts are higher than all state courts. All right, the next thing that Congress had to do was create a Bill of Rights. Now, if you remember, after they created the Constitution, they made 13 copies and they had to send it out to all the states. And the states had to ratify. Well, under the new Constitution, only 3/4 of the states had to ratify for it to go into effect, which was 9. Well, they got 9 states to ratify. And the others, but they wanted all of them to ratify, because they didn't want somebody later on coming back and saying, hey, we didn't even ratify it, but we have to live by it. So they really wanted it to be unanimous. So they went to the states that didn't ratify, and they asked them why. Why won't you ratify this? And they said because it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. So they made a deal with the states that didn't ratify. They said, if you ratify it, we promise we will put in a Bill of Rights later. So the states all agreed, they all ratified, and now it's later. This first Congress had a lot of stuff to do. I mean, the government wasn't even set up yet. They set up those departments. Then they had to set up the court system. Now they have to put in a Bill of Rights. So that first Congress had a lot of jobs to do. All right, so Americans had long feared a strong national government. Many people insisted that the Constitution needed to include guarantees of personal liberties, and some states had only supported the Constitution on the condition that a Bill of Rights be added later. Well, to fulfill the promise of adding a Bill of Rights, James Madison introduced a set of amendments during the first session of Congress. Now, actually Madison drew up 12 amendments, and the 12 amendments passed Congress, so they made 13 copies of the 12 amendments and passed them out to all the states. But when they went out for ratification, only 10 of them were ratified, so 2 did not get ratified. So that's why the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and not 12. So in 1791, these 10 amendments were added to the Constitution and became known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights limits the power of government. Its purpose is to protect the rights of individual liberty, like freedom of speech, rights of persons accused of crime, including trial by jury. Remember, the First Amendment to the Constitution is freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Number 2 was the right to bear arms. Number 3, you don't have to quarter soldiers in your homes. 4, you're protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. 5 was you don't have to testify against yourself. You can't be tried for the same crime twice, double jeopardy. And you can't take away someone's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 6, you are guaranteed a speedy and public trial. 7, a trial by jury. 8, you're protected against cruel and unusual punishment. 9, just because it's not listed in the Constitution does not mean it's not a right. And number 10, if certain powers are not given to the federal government by the Constitution, then they go back to the states. So the 10th Amendment protects the rights of states and individuals by saying that the powers not specifically given to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. With the 10th Amendment, Madison hoped to use the states as a line of defense against a too powerful national government. And that is your video lesson of the day. So make sure you finish up your note taker, your EQs, and your notebook assignment. Thanks, kids, and have a great day.